This country in South America is called Peru, and it attracts tourists with its coastal views and ancient city ruins. It is also where China conducts business, so the PRC arrived in Peru not just as tourists, but also in typical fashion with a $3 billion mega project that sent ships swarming the peaceful coast near the capital, Lima, and began collecting tons of sand from the ocean floor. Naturally, the Chinese builders did not forego building a tunnel. Have you ever seen a significant Chinese project that did not include a high-tech tunnel through solid rock? To put it simply, this is all about drastically altering trade between China and South America. But if you want the specifics, let's get started. Hold on a minute. Just think of how the US would respond if China suddenly started a huge project next door. We'll discuss that as well. Let's get started. In the year 2000, trade between South American nations and China wasn't particularly impressive. It cost only approximately $3 to go back to China, while $5 billion worth of commodities flowed through China to Brazil, Chile, Peru, Argentina, and several other adjacent nations. At the beginning of the new century, less than 2% of Latin America's exports, worth $9 billion, went to China. So you understand if only these South American nations in China had realized at the time what this would become. The Chinese government claims that over the following 8 years, trade between Latin America and China increased by an average of 31% annually. In 2021, the Chinese government released the following data. By 2022, trade between South America and China had already reached a record-breaking $450 billion. South American countries were receiving goods worth over $33 billion from China and sending out nearly $200 billion in return, indicating that trade is booming and that more and more soybeans and other vegetables are being shipped out. According to the Economic Commission for Latin America, from 2010 to 2022, this region of the world supplied China with almost one-third of its food imports. In addition, South American nations have been actively transporting copper oil, cooking oil, and other raw materials required to maintain China's ever-increasing food supply. Growing industry, lithium stands out in particular because it is mined actively in the Andes of South America and is highly sought after in China, the world's largest producer of electric vehicles, which uses it for batteries in exchange for higher-value industrial goods. In fact, China accounts for nearly half of Latin America's imports. About 27% of the commodities imported from China include home appliances, electronics, toys, and domestic items, while 52% are computers, telecom gear, and industrial equipment. The remaining 7% are clothing, textiles, and shoes. 5% of imports plus an additional 7. 3% is composed of industrial chemicals, fertilizers, and plastic products. In other words, food and raw materials travel from South America to China, where they are converted into finished goods. Latin America is the source of resources, and China is where things are manufactured. Trade volumes are increasing for everyone. Happy, but there's still a problem with getting all these goods shipped. The quickest way to ship goods would be to ship them straight from the South American west coast to China and back, exactly like we just demonstrated, but that wasn't an option. Instead, the goods were assembled in China and shipped, say, the port of Hong Kong, and then proceeded to the ports of Manzano in Mexico or Long Beach in the United States across the Pacific. Only then were the goods shipped to the intended South American destination. If the goods were to be shipped to countries in the central or even eastern regions of the continent, container ships had to traverse the Panama Canal, which is the only practical and fastest way to get from the Pacific to the Atlantic. However, even though it is crucial for international trade, the 50-mile-long narrow passage between the two oceans isn't very practical for moving cargo. Its typical daily capacity is 36 to 38 ships. Already establishes a limit that limits trade opportunities between China and South America. Additionally, the Panama Canal is relatively narrow, and any issue could drastically reduce its traffic. For instance, in 2023, the region's average temperature increased while rainfall decreased by 35% as a result of a natural disaster. Phenomena known as El Niño, which caused the water level in Gatun Lake, the primary reservoir supplying the locks of the Panama Canal, to drop significantly from the operational norm of 88 feet to a concerning 78 feet. The result is traffic jams where at one point there were roughly 200 ships in a slightly better situation. Had about 150 vessels, and by September of that year, 89 container ships were waiting to pass. This was because the average waiting time to go through the canal had increased significantly. In August 2023, it was nearly 4 times higher than in June, and the decrease in the canal's maximum daily capacity was also the reason for the jams. The Panama Canal Authority began lowering the maximum permitted draft, or the distance between the waterline and the bottom of the hole, last year. Previously, the maximum allowed draft was 49 feet. However, during the most problematic period, this number was lowered to as low as 22 ships. There was probably no way around it, but just think of what container ships had to do to lower their draft. They had to spend more money, time, and every minute, especially in global shipping, where the draft was lowered to 43 feet for the largest class of ships. Therefore, some container ships had to lighten their load. Even in the absence of incidents, the time it took to ship goods from China to the eastern region of South America was still very long, and using the Panama Canal always came with additional costs, even in the absence of droughts. Trade is extremely valuable, and the canal had never experienced problems of this magnitude before, though minor problems are still fairly common. Or excessive waiting insurance costs, which range from $60,000 to $200,000, which greatly increased export costs. In other words, the Panama Canal, while a lifesaver, wasn't particularly profitable, and the Chinese port in Peru, which is intended to save trading nations from additional expenses and expedite the flow of goods, isn't that the. In 2007, a former admiral of the Peruvian Navy came up with the idea to build a port south of the historic Chiang Pier. In 2016, they even started the first steps of the project, though it was much smaller in scope. That was right around the time that trade between China and South America was booming. In 2019, the Peruvian company. In general, China brought its customary approach to mega projects and their prices to Peru, but Vulcan and Chinese Costco Shipping chose to revisit an old idea. They assigned tasks, completed the design work, engineering developments, and much more. They also announced the total cost of building the port would reach or possibly exceed $3 billion. The first phase of the Chang Port project began in 2021 and involved the construction of 4 berths, each 1,300 feet long, 2 for containers and 2 for multipurpose purposes. This is not particularly surprising, but one more crucial detail stood out among the dozens of others. Unlike in 2007, they actually began working on it. There are standard container ship sizes that indicate whether they can pass through the Panama Canal. The first is called Panamax, and it is determined by the size of the ships that arrived at the construction site and began removing millions of tons of sand, silt, and whatever else was down there, which is why the project required dredging. A container ship that receives this title has the proper dimensions to pass through the oldest locks, which are the canal's original lock chambers, each of which is 110 feet wide, 150 feet long, and has a draft of 41 feet. Next, there is Neopanax, which was created when a set of larger gates with increased length, width, and depth were constructed, allowing ships with a. Although there are container ships in the world that can carry more cargo and meet the post-Panamax standard, if we don't get into the specifics, they are simply larger than the maximum size permitted. This means that the Panama Canal can now accommodate container ships carrying up to 14,020 feet containers, which is the maximum the canal can take. In essence, the dredging brought out Chang's main feature, its maximum depth reaching 58 feet, making the port the first location on the west coast of South America that can handle mega container vessels holding up. However, they are unable to pass through the Panama Canal, which is a major problem because post-Panamax ships could make trade much more efficient. As we stated at the outset, it is uncommon to see Chinese projects without a tunnel, so Peru is also getting one. In the port of Chang, they were drilling to create a tunnel connected to port operations, which has 3 traffic lanes for vehicles with a combined length of 18,020 feet. The connection goes through a special access complex that cuts through the mountain rock, and everything is done in the Chinese way. If you've watched our videos, you know what we mean when we say that the speed limit is set at 37 miles per hour, which is sufficient for goods to pass through the one. Additionally, there are 2 conveyor belts for solid bulk materials and pipelines for liquid cargo, as well as a 1-mile tunnel that can be traversed fairly swiftly and safely. Most significantly, all of this is connected to the Pan-Amazon Highway, which makes it simple to transport the goods arriving from China to almost any Western South country. In Chiang, they constructed 2 yards for bulk and general cargo and 2 more for containers, which are essentially the standard amenities for any modern port. Did you know that seaports are impacted by waves? This is dangerous not because ships can easily transport goods from America to China. Because of the gradual deterioration of port infrastructure and shoreline erosion, a container ship may suddenly capsize, but that's not all the ocean or sea can do to a port. Currents may bring silt into the port area, which over time may cause Chang to change from a post-Panamax port to a Panamax one, meaning its depth will drop too. To guard against all of this, the Chinese and Peruvians constructed a breakwater, which is visible on your displays and is 1 meter long. 6 miles, which obviously doesn't qualify it as a record holder, but that's not important in this case. These measurements are sufficient for protection, and the breakwater has thousands of tons of. The port is generally protected from destruction for many years to come thanks to gravel and 25,700 units of special acropode blocks, which required 4 million cubic feet of concrete to make. It may sound odd, but fruit marked the opening of a new route between South America and China after the first phase of construction was finished. Xi'an dispatched the Chinese ship Xin Shanghai to Shanghai with 20,000 tons of fruit, including mangoes, avocados, blueberries, and grapes. The key takeaway is that the ship arrived in China from Peru in just 23 days, indicating that the port is actually accelerating trade between China and Latin American nations. The test proceeded as planned. So does that mean it's time to continue building? Nope. A month later, the first shipment of Chinese-made electric cars arrived in Peru for fruit on a large container ship that arrived quickly and exactly as scheduled. No one is waiting for the project to be completed because China is crucial to trade between China and South America. Already operational, but work will continue concurrently. In the second phase of the project, the operational zone will be completed by adding 11 additional docks, increasing the total to 15, and the cost will increase from $3 billion to roughly $6 billion, so it's time to determine who will receive what when Xi'an is finished. First, this will help China and Peru, as well as South America overall. According to the plans, Xi'an can handle 1 million TEUs or 1 million 20-foot containers annually, and that's only the short term. Anticipated to manage up to 1. According to the first container ships to pass through the port, the Panama Canal and other routes are excluded from the 5 million 20-foot containers that are brought in year. This is another really impressive figure. The port will be able to receive over 40,000 tons of products per day. The port is extremely helpful for China and South America, and let's not forget about other countries, because it will reduce travel time from approximately 35 to 23 days. Additionally, let's reiterate that the port can handle post-Panamax container ships, which the Panama Canal still cannot. All of this will save money, which is typically what countries aim for when they trade. Now that Asian countries have a much simpler and more lucrative way to trade with South American countries, let's examine the advantages for Peru. According to several reports, this particular country might make up to $5 billion from the port, but building of any kind also creates jobs. Despite the fact that many Chinese workers are currently employed in the Xi'an area, Peruvians are also participating, and it is said that after the port's construction is complete, Asian tourists will depart and the South American nation will gain 8,000 jobs. There are issues as well. For instance, local communities have expressed. Fishermen who depend on the area around Newport for their livelihoods say the construction has disrupted their activities, and they fear their livelihoods may dry up. There are also worries about the project's social and economic effects, as it has been reported that increased road traffic has impacted the air quality and noise levels in nearby towns. Completely why it is impossible to build something like this without having some sort of detrimental effect on the local wildlife, especially those in the water. Construction waste and all that is the reason why some fish species may swim away or vanish entirely, and those fish provide the fishermen with income, so the concern is completely valid, but there's one more problem, and it's much more serious than the others. The US has been attempting to establish its dominance in South America for decades, and these nations have recently been actively competing on the global scene. Now there's even a new port next to the US, and it's this huge. The US dislikes the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI, because it is expanding China's global influence. Recently, Panama was a part of the BRI initiative, which includes the Panama Canal, which we had already discussed today. Shortly ago, the US put pressure on Panama, which is why they withdrew from the initiative. Trump claims that the state's backyards need security, but South America is gradually moving toward trade relations with China, and Peru even allowed China to build a port that will serve as the primary trading hub between South America and Asia. As a result, many people are anticipating some action from the US under Trump, especially after the launch of China. In 2023, when Xi'an was still under construction, the American think tank CSIS abruptly began voicing concerns about the new port, claiming that the US government was extremely concerned about Peru's national security. According to one report, container ships are unlikely to approach the US-controlled Panama Canal. The port's features make it the ideal location for Chinese military vessels to dock, which raises the prospect that Peru could act as a base for the Chinese fleet in South America. However, these are currently just conjectures. What is certain is that the new port has already benefited Asia and South America and will maintain supplying them going forward.